Ryder Blaine never saw himself as a landowner in the traditional sense. He wasn't born into wealth or a long line of ranchers, and he wasn't particularly drawn to solitude or grandeur. He was a man of structure, of clean borders, and a deep, almost obsessive respect for functional land. He came from a background not of sprawling acres but blueprints and field measurements. Decades spent working in water resource management and civil planning gave him a professional sense of space, of use and misuse. So, when his great-uncle died and left him a patch of Arizona land that once formed part of a cattle corridor stretching back to the 1800s, Ryder didn't hesitate. He didn't romanticize the place. He assessed it like a project. Overgrown trails, neglected fencing, worn-down structures that used to be barns or stables, he saw it all for what it could be if treated with respect and boundaries. And boundaries were something Ryder valued more than anything else. The first year on the property was nothing short of transformative. Ryder had no grand ambitions of turning it into a retreat, a tourist spot, or a public space. Quite the opposite. He intended to use it as a monitored restoration zone. While others might have fancied a porch and a hammock, Ryder installed remote sensors to study soil recovery, set up a small solar-powered pump system to restore the old well for irrigation use, and mapped out areas where native plants could regrow, without interference. The goal was not to tame the land, but to leave it alone, scientifically. No all-terrain vehicles, no campers, no stargazers looking for dark-sky tourism. Just data, silence, and integrity. The nearest neighbor was almost a mile away by road, but local politics and personalities had a way of bleeding across fences. Karen Mitchell lived in a stucco split level surrounded by lavender hedges and motivational signage. She wasn't from the area originally, but she'd settled into it with the determination of someone who wanted to mold the desert to her liking. Her reputation in the area preceded her. Chairwoman of the Women's Auxiliary Club, unofficial event coordinator, and self-styled heritage ambassador of the county. She had an answer to every question no one asked, and most conversations with her felt like walking into a well-rehearsed monologue about community spirit. Ryder kept his distance, not out of dislike, but out of an instinctual aversion to people who talked in slogans. They met properly on a Tuesday morning, shortly after Ryder posted new signage on the Eastern Access Road. The signs were direct and legally formatted. Private land, no trespassing, no tours, no photography. Owner enforces civil penalties. He had them laminated against UV wear and posted them on aluminum stakes every 50 yards. Karen showed up later that morning, walking her golden retriever along the border path like she had every right in the world to be there. She waved before she spoke, her voice bouncing like she was greeting an old friend. "Well, hey there, stranger." "I was wondering when you'd come out of your little man cave," she said, chuckling as though she were sharing a private joke. Ryder kept it cordial. "Morning." She didn't stop at the fence. "Hope you're not putting up all those signs just to scare people off. You know, some of us used to walk through here years ago when Frank owned it. Just a peaceful little trail, nothing that'd bother anyone." He gave a light nod, polite but flat. "That was before. The land's under active monitoring now. Lot of recovery underway. Foot traffic disrupts it." Karen's face pinched slightly before softening again. Of course. I just thought I'd ask. You know, some of the ladies at the club have been saying how beautiful this place looks from the hilltop. We were thinking it'd be a shame not to let the community appreciate it." "I mean, what's the point of preserving beauty if no one sees it?" Ryder didn't answer right away. He looked past her toward the thinned tree line, where he'd just installed a remote thermal sensor calibrated to detect coyotes, rabbits, and other mammals over 10 pounds. She wouldn't understand the importance of undisturbed movement patterns, and he wasn't interested in debating its value. "I get that," he said slowly, "but it's private land. I'm not offering tours. Not now. Not ever." Karen's smile faded for half a second before returning, stiffer this time. "Of course, no pressure. Just thought I'd bring it up. Anyway, welcome to the neighborhood. She left a zip-locked bundle of banana bread on the fence post before walking off, dog in tow. Ryder didn't touch the bread. Weeks passed without incident, though he noticed increased foot traffic near the north gate. It was subtle. Tire prints from smaller vehicles, discarded water bottles, one or two unfamiliar boot impressions. He started reviewing footage from his trail cameras more frequently. No one was caught in direct trespass, but signs pointed toward rising activity. He installed another line of passive infrared sensors along the dry wash near the South Trail, just in case. And then, one Saturday, a black van appeared. Ryder spotted it from his west loft window, pulling up along the dirt edge of the unpaved road. 8 people stepped out. 4 adults, 3 teenagers, 1 older man with a DSLR hanging from his neck. A woman stood in front of them holding what looked like laminated handouts. Ryder walked down the slope quietly, staying behind the mesquite. He didn't confront them, not then. He just listened. The woman, someone he'd never seen before, was gesturing toward his land. This part used to be part of the original cattle run that stretched from the old Baines Trail. See the stone outcropping? That's where early settlers used to rest before crossing to Prescott. What we're seeing here is a living relic of our local legacy. The tourists nodded, snapped photos, and began walking toward the tree line, exactly 30 yards inside Ryder's property boundary. No permission, no warning. Later that evening, Ryder found a web page titled Blaine Ranch Eco Walks, hosted through a DIY ticketing platform. $35 a head. Guided walking tour through a private piece of Arizona heritage land. The description read, home to native flora, historic structures, and wildlife. Managed by local historian and nature advocate Karen Mitchell. There were photos, his photos, pulled from a university publication where he'd presented a short paper on native species retention. His blood didn't boil, it cooled. Controlled fury came in the form of procedure. He screenshotted the site, saved the metadata, and printed a full PDF record. Then he drafted and hand-delivered 6 formal no trespassing violation notices based on Arizona Civil Code 13-1502. Each addressed to whom it may concern, with blank lines to fill in names. He didn't wait for anyone to pick them up. He left them taped to the fence where the van had parked. 3 days later, the banana bread was back, this time with a note. You could have just talked to me. Don't let stubbornness cost you community. Ryder threw it all in the trash. The land wasn't a museum. It wasn't a park. And it certainly wasn't a stage for someone else's amateur performance of local culture. It was a place with real value, scientific and personal, and he wasn't going to let someone like Karen wrap it in folksy language and sell it as some sanitized product for strangers. If she wanted a fight, he would give her one. But on paper, with facts, with lines drawn not in emotion, but in law. Because the one thing Ryder Blaine understood better than anyone was this. Once people stop recognizing boundaries, it's only a matter of time before they start thinking nothing belongs to anyone. And that's when the real damage begins. It wasn't until the second weekend of October that Ryder realized the situation had shifted from annoying to dangerous. Up until that point, the so-called tours led by Karen seemed sporadic, random gatherings of overly enthusiastic retirees and local hikers who, once confronted, would typically mumble apologies and retreat back to their cars. He had hoped his direct confrontation via posted notices and legal warnings would dissuade further incursions. But, as with anything that gave Karen even a sliver of public attention, things escalated. On that particular Saturday morning, Ryder woke before dawn. It had become habit now. Early perimeter checks, system diagnostics, camera reviews. He used to spend those hours mapping out water flow plans or analyzing soil data. Now he found himself scanning for footprints and license plates. That morning, he noticed something different. The west gate sensor had tripped twice, once at 4:36 a.m. and again at 4:48 a.m. That alone didn't mean much. Could be an animal, wind, maybe a stray coyote. But when Ryder reviewed the footage from the fixed thermal camera, what he saw made him grip the edge of the desk. Two individuals, adult-sized, wearing backpacks and what appeared to be headlamps, stepping over the boundary wire and walking along. The dry ridge trail, no lights, no talking, just deliberate, quiet movement. By 8 a.m., a line of parked vehicles had formed along the shoulder of the county access road. Minivans, compact SUVs, even a chartered passenger van with a magnetic decal that read Nature and Heritage Collective, Local Guided Experiences. Ryder stood at the top of the bluff and watched through binoculars as groups of people, some with walking sticks, others with collapsible chairs, gathered in a semicircle at the northern trailhead. This was no casual drop-in. This was organized, systematic, commercial. He headed down on foot, boots grinding against the gravel with steady weight, rifles slung across his back, not loaded, not even chambered, but visible enough to make clear he wasn't coming to negotiate. He kept a calm face, jaw clenched as he approached the group. As he arrived, the woman in front turned mid-sentence, smiling as if greeting an old friend. It wasn't Karen. It was someone younger, maybe late 30s, clipboard in hand and headset mic resting against her cheek. "Good morning," she said, still smiling. "You must be Mr. Blaine. Karen told us you might stop by." Ryder didn't return the pleasantry. "You're on private land," he said flatly. "I didn't authorize any of this." A few people shifted uncomfortably, some looking at their phones, others whispering. The guide seemed unbothered. "Actually, we were informed this section is historically considered transitional access. Karen has documentation showing—" "No," Ryder interrupted. "There's no documentation. There's no access. There's a property line that every one of you crossed without permission. That's criminal trespassing in the state of Arizona." The guide hesitated, eyes darting toward a man behind her who looked to be recording. Ryder didn't flinch. "Leave. Now. Before I have the sheriff down here issuing citations to every one of you." It took a few minutes, but the group eventually began to scatter. There were murmurs of refunds, awkward apologies, and one particularly loud tourist muttering something about angry locals and paranoia. Ryder didn't respond to any of it. He simply stood and watched until every last person was either in their car or on the way to it. As the last vehicle drove off, his attention turned to the trail markers, freshly painted wooden signs hammered into the dirt, staked with flagging tape. One of them even had a printed QR code laminated in plastic. He scanned it with his phone. It linked to a branded page on Karen's website with bold lettering, "Welcome to Blaine Ranch Tours, Restoring Access to Arizona's Natural Heritage." The page featured scheduled events, rates, tour packages, and even a section titled Educational. Partnerships that falsely listed affiliations with the State University and the Historical Society. There were over 70 reviews, some written as recently as 2 days ago. Many referenced Karen's charming storytelling, access to private wilderness, and rare wildlife sightings. Ryder stared at the screen for a long moment before locking it and heading back to the house. That evening, he made 3 phone calls. The first was to his lawyer, a sharp, quiet woman named Marissa Hillman, who'd helped him sort out water rights when he first inherited the land. She listened in silence as Ryder explained the situation, and when he finished, she sighed. "We'll start with a cease and desist. But you need to prepare for this being a longer fight than you expect. If she's charging people and promoting false affiliations, it's not just trespassing anymore. It's fraud, liability, and potentially land title manipulation if she's tried registering access paths through county channels." The second call was to the county assessor's office. He requested an expedited verification of his parcel boundaries and easements. The clerk was cooperative but cautious, clearly aware of ongoing complaints filed by Karen in recent months, claiming community right-of-way encroachment. The third call was to a private security firm specializing in property monitoring and documentation. Ryder didn't want guards, but he did want independent, third-party verification of who was coming and going and when. Paper trails mattered now. 2 days later, while walking the ridge trail at dusk, Ryder found something that solidified his worst suspicion. Nailed to the trunk of an old juniper was a laminated flyer, bright orange and impossible to miss. Next tour, this Sunday, 10 a.m. Bring water and good shoes. Park at Lower Creek. Do not disturb the owner. Observe silently. It was signed simply, K.M. That same evening, someone left a voicemail on Ryder's landline. He rarely used it, mostly spam, a few old vendor contacts, but this one stood out. A woman's voice, light, composed, and unmistakably performative. "Hey Ryder, it's Karen. I wanted to let you know there was a little mix-up with one of the guides last week. Totally my fault. I told her we had soft clearance to use the North Ridge, but I guess we hadn't finalized everything yet. I'd love to talk more about making this work in a way that benefits everyone. We're not looking to be a nuisance, just to bring people closer to the beauty of this land. Call me." He didn't call. He took a printout of the voicemail transcript and added it to the legal file. By the end of the week, he had his official cease and desist, boundary verification documents, and an early security report that already logged 2 additional unauthorized entries in the past 48 hours. His legal team prepared a formal demand letter citing unlawful use of private property for commercial gain, defamation, and false claims of academic and government affiliation. But before it could be sent, another event pushed everything off course. On Friday morning, just past 6:30 a.m., Ryder found his irrigation shed vandalized. Nothing stolen, but the hinges had been smashed with a blunt object and the padlock was sheared. Inside, someone had ripped the sensor wiring from the monitor box and dumped a gallon of water on the control panel, shorting the system. On the back wall, written in black spray paint, "Nature doesn't belong to you." He stood in the doorway for several minutes, not angry, not even shocked, just deeply, quietly aware of the fact that this was no longer about hiking or community. Goodwill. This was pressure, escalation. Someone was trying to push him into a reaction or a mistake, or maybe just off the land altogether. But Ryder wasn't going anywhere. He didn't inherit the land to let someone else brand it with false purpose. He had the patience of someone who measured things in soil regeneration cycles, not news cycles. And Karen had just crossed a line she didn't even seem to realize existed. She thought she was playing public relations. Ryder was preparing for war. The kind fought in courtrooms, on county records, through affidavits and boundary resolutions. Not with rage, but with cold, procedural devastation. And she wouldn't see it coming until the land she thought she could use turned on her with the force of law behind it. The morning after the vandalism, Ryder Blaine sat at his dining table surrounded by documentation. His breakfast sat untouched, growing cold beside a thick file folder filled with printed screenshots, time-stamped images, copies of posted signs, and hand-signed incident logs from the private security firm he had hired 2 weeks prior. The local sheriff's deputy who responded to the report about the shed was polite, even sympathetic, but ultimately non-committal. "Could be kids," the deputy had offered with a shrug, as if the phrase absolved any real investigation. Ryder knew it wasn't kids. The target was precise. His monitoring equipment, not tools or valuables, and the message on the wall, "Nature doesn't belong to you," wasn't the language of vandals looking for a thrill. It was a protest, a warning, possibly a threat, and it was personal. The deputy's report was already filed, but Ryder understood that the wheels of official enforcement turned slowly and usually only when pressed. That's why, despite his contempt for theatrics, he spent the next 4 hours preparing a full evidentiary submission package for Marissa, his attorney. He itemized damage, included quotes for repairs and replacement, outlined potential loss of data from environmental monitoring, and, most importantly, highlighted the pattern. This wasn't a one-off. This was part of a developing conflict in which property lines, legal notices, and technological safeguards were being ignored and actively undermined. By early afternoon, Marissa had sent the formal cease and desist letter to Karen Mitchell via certified mail and email, with copies forwarded to the county recorder's office and the Regional Business Registration Bureau. The letter outlined 10 violations of civil law and 2 categories of potential criminal exposure. It demanded immediate cessation of all promotional activity, removal of all online content using Ryder's name or property, and payment for damages incurred. But even as Ryder watched the notification confirm Karen's receipt, he had the creeping sense that this wouldn't end with a letter. He was right. 3 days later, a local blogger published a feature titled, "Who Really Owns Arizona's Land?" The piece was riddled with soft-edged commentary on land use, peppered with loaded phrases like gatekeeping nature, privatized wilderness, and resistance to community access. Ryder's name appeared 5 times, each carefully positioned to avoid direct accusation, yet clearly marked as the antagonist in a debate he never agreed to have. Quotes from Karen framed her as a steward, a humble guide working to reconnect residents with a sacred landscape lost to bureaucracy and ego. Nowhere in the article was there mention of Ryder's monitoring work, his conservation efforts, or the fact that the land was legally and unambiguously his. He had never even spoken to the blogger, who had made no attempt to contact him for comment. The article was accompanied by filtered photos, sunlit paths, smiling hikers, a picnic setup beneath a cottonwood tree with a caption reading, "Community Joy at Blaine Ranch." Ryder recognized the location instantly. It was 250 feet inside his boundary line. The article was picked up by a local weekly paper and then reposted by a regional tourism page on social media. Comments flooded in. Some were harmless. "Looks beautiful," or "Didn't know we had trails like this nearby," but others carried venom. "Typical rich outsider locking up land for himself. Another man playing God with a fence. If he cared about nature, he'd share it." Ryder didn't respond publicly. He never did, but he took action. First, he ordered a comprehensive parcel audit, requesting certified documentation of his title history, boundary surveys, easement maps, and usage rights. He had all of it already, but now he needed it collated, notarized, and ready for legal defense. Then, through Marissa, he filed a defamation notice against the blogger and the publication, demanding retraction and clarification. Most crucially, he escalated the case to the state level, specifically to the Department of Real Estate and the Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Division. If Karen was accepting money for unauthorized access to private land, advertising false partnerships, and promoting activity that resulted in property damage, it was no longer a neighborhood feud. It was commercial fraud. That same week, 2 things happened that signaled a shift in Karen's tactics. First, a new group of tourists arrived, not from the usual minivan drop-offs, but in a rented charter bus marked with a company name Ryder didn't recognize. He intercepted them before they even got off. When he identified himself and informed them they were trespassing, several seemed genuinely shocked. One woman showed him an invoice, $208 for Historical Land Access Tour, including boxed lunch and eco-hiking workshop. The seller listed wasn't Karen Mitchell. It was Southwest Living Tours LLC, a business registered in the neighboring county. When Ryder pulled the registration later that night, the agent of record was a man named Dennis Mitchell, Karen's brother. Second, he received a certified letter from a law office, Wilkins & Tate, on behalf of their client, Karen Mitchell. The letter claimed that Ryder had engaged in aggressive, threatening behavior toward lawful visitors, that he was obstructing customary recreational use rights based on historic informal passage, and that his actions constituted a form of land harassment. It threatened civil action if Ryder continued to intimidate or record tour participants without consent. Marissa nearly laughed when she read it, but Ryder didn't. He knew this wasn't just noise. It was foundation laying. Karen wasn't operating in isolation anymore. She was building legal camouflage, aligning her activity with vague notions of community tradition, and turning the narrative into a culture war, private land versus public spirit. He was being outflanked not through fact, but through perception. In response, Ryder filed a preemptive lawsuit for injunctive relief and damages, requesting an emergency hearing. The evidence was on his side. Photographic records, signed declarations from security contractors, timestamps, GPS logs, and payment records tied to Southwest Living tours. But even as Marissa drafted the filing, another blow landed. The county's Planning and Development Office sent Ryder a notification of a formal complaint filed against him, alleging that he had erected unauthorized fencing structures and had violated zoning codes by restricting public access to historical trails. Attached was a hand-drawn map with highlighted areas and notes in handwriting he immediately recognized as Karen's. She had sketched a path through his property, labeled Community Access Trail, and even added exaggerated landmarks: Old Cattle Gate, Wildflower Field, Historic Rock Cross. None of those were formal. Some didn't even exist. But she'd filed it, and now the county was obligated to investigate. Ryder called Marissa the moment he finished reading. She didn't hesitate. "We'll file a counterclaim," she said, "and I'll request that all pending complaints be frozen until our lawsuit is heard. But I need you to understand something. This is going to get worse before it gets better. She's turning this into a movement. And if people believe they have a right to your land, facts won't stop them. Only a judge can." That night, Ryder did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He called his old friend Wayne Talbot, a retired county sheriff turned private consultant, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and meticulous process. Ryder didn't ask for security or muscle. He asked for documentation, for strategy, and for a mind not afraid to wade into the murky intersection of law, manipulation, and public perception. Wayne agreed to come by the following day. As Ryder sat outside that night, listening to the distant hum of insects and the creak of the wooden swing under him, he looked across the land that had once been quiet, untouched, his to steward in peace. Now it was a target, a symbol hijacked by someone who saw profit and power in repackaging history and nature into a product. Karen hadn't just ignored his boundaries. She'd co-opted his name, his work, and the land's identity. And now, she was daring him to defend it not as a man with a fence, but as a man with rights. Ryder intended to do just that. When Wayne Talbot arrived at Ryder's property the following morning, he did not come with sirens or showmanship. He came with a tan notebook, a black coffee, and a presence that spoke less of intimidation and more of careful calculation. Wayne had spent over 30 years in law enforcement, and though he'd long since traded badges for consultation reports, his instincts had not dulled. He listened as Ryder laid out the pattern: the unauthorized tours, the vandalism, the social campaign, the legal counters, and now, the attempt to embed fictional historic paths into public record. Wayne didn't interrupt. He asked only one question when Ryder finished. "You have the files printed and time-stamped?" Ryder nodded, handing over a binder thick enough to hold a semester's worth of casework. Wayne flipped through it slowly, then closed it and gave a quiet, satisfied grunt. "All right, then we treat this the way it should have been treated from the start. As a campaign, not a dispute. You're not dealing with confusion. You're dealing with someone creating plausible layers of justification for their trespassing. That's not neighborly misunderstanding. That's orchestrated erosion of ownership. For the next 3 days, Wayne set to work like a field investigator. He walked the perimeter with Ryder, logging camera positions, inspecting signage for legal sufficiency, photographing fresh markings, and noting the distance between flagged tour stops and the actual property boundaries. He made calls to colleagues in land use planning, requesting quiet confirmations about whether any new proposals had been filed concerning the area. He reviewed Karen's public statements and compared them to documented activity, building a timeline that would hold up under cross-examination. What became increasingly clear, both to him and to Ryder, was that Karen's strategy relied on soft enforcement gaps. She wasn't bulldozing fences or breaking into homes. She was applying pressure in the spaces between legal certainty and communal myth. The real battle was not about access, it was about narrative. And that realization pushed Ryder to act on something he had previously avoided: public counterexposure. Ryder authorized Marissa to issue a formal press release, stripped of emotional language but heavy on specificity. It laid out the facts: documented trespassing events, unauthorized commercial activity on private land, damage to equipment, and misrepresentation of property status in public materials. The release was distributed not to social media, but to regional legal journals, landowner associations, and local governance bodies. Within days, Ryder was invited to speak briefly at the quarterly meeting of the County Landowners Council. He accepted, not out of a desire to sway opinion, but to ensure that when Karen eventually spun this into an anti-landowner crusade, the other stakeholders in the region would have context and a reason not to join her chorus. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground grew more volatile. A new set of visitors arrived midweek, not tourists, but a camera crew from a small digital media outfit. They claimed to be filming a documentary on land equity and the reclamation of nature. Ryder confronted them calmly, informed them they were on private land, and asked them to leave. They did, but not before filming his refusal, a moment that later appeared in a video titled, "Man Claims to Own What Nature Gave to All." The footage was edited for effect, complete with pensive music and sepia filters. Ryder did not respond publicly, but Wayne took the time to file a rights infringement complaint and have the video flagged for deceptive content. It was a game of attrition now, one where every false step required a precise legal correction. But Ryder's patience, however disciplined, began to fray when another incident confirmed how deeply Karen had embedded her false legitimacy. A group of schoolchildren arrived in a yellow bus, accompanied by 2 adult chaperones. They carried clipboards and field guides, laughing and pointing at butterflies near the northern slope. Ryder approached with confusion, then alarm. The group leader, a soft-spoken woman named Elise, looked puzzled when he informed her they were trespassing. "But we're here for the educational walk. Karen Mitchell arranged it through the county's youth enrichment program. She said this was protected land." Ryder's response was measured, but final. "You've been misled. This is not a county site. This is privately owned. You need to leave immediately." He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse Elise, but the damage was done. The children filed back onto the bus, some visibly disappointed, some simply confused. Ryder felt it viscerally. Not just the trespass, but the manipulation of others to advance a lie. That evening, he sat in silence longer than usual, considering whether containment was still possible. Not in terms of land, but in terms of story. Karen was no longer just organizing events. She was curating a myth in which she was the redeemer of stolen land, and Ryder was the villain with a deed. The facts were on his side, but perception had begun to erode truth like wind on rock. Something had to change. 2 days later, Ryder and Marissa filed for a temporary restraining order against Karen, citing ongoing harassment, public defamation, and commercial interference. The judge granted the order on a preliminary basis, pending a full hearing. It barred Karen and her affiliates from organizing or promoting any activity involving his land. It also prohibited her from making public statements implying shared or community ownership of the property. But while the legal process advanced, Ryder and Wayne knew that the real battle wasn't in the courthouse. It was in the inboxes and community boards of the county, where reality was being rewritten through repetition and insinuation. To regain the narrative, Ryder agreed to an interview, not with a journalist, but with a landowner podcast popular in the region. It was informal, practical, and focused on legal precedent. He spoke clearly, without rhetoric, detailing the steps he'd taken, the legal status of his land, and the risks of tolerating casual incursions. He didn't mention Karen by name. He didn't have to. Those who needed to understand did. The middle of that month brought a lull, brief but instructive. The tours stopped. The traffic thinned. Even the online commentary slowed. Ryder used the time to repair the irrigation shed, recalibrate his monitoring systems, and walk the perimeter with Wayne one last time before the man returned to his home 2 counties over. "You've done everything right," Wayne told him before leaving. "But don't confuse legal ground with moral closure. She'll be back, and next time she won't come from the front." Ryder nodded but said nothing. He had expected nothing less. That night, as the sun sank beneath the ridgeline and the silhouettes of mesquite trees cast long shadows across the dry grass, Ryder looked out at the land he was trying so desperately to protect. Not just from development or pollution, but from narrative theft. The slow, deliberate erosion of truth through charm and repetition. He didn't fear Karen. He feared what she represented. The weaponization of community sentiment against ownership, of public myth against private fact. And he knew, deep down, that the next move wouldn't be hers alone. Someone else would be waiting in the wings, ready to test the same breach with a different smile. He was ready for it. The first signs of backlash had been subtle, a county complaint, a smear blog post, but now the escalation was unmistakable, tangible in every sensor ping and broken fence post. It happened just as the court issued the temporary restraining order against Karen Mitchell, barring her from organizing tours or using any false affiliation with public or academic institutions. That should have cleared the air, provided legal clarity. Instead, the backlash intensified. On a damp Wednesday morning, Ryder climbed the ridge trail and noticed footprints through the eastern perimeter grasses, pressed close to the fence lines where the titanium wire touched the ground. Not large, not many, but deliberate. He knelt to inspect and froze. 2 prints side by side, toes splayed slightly outward, consistent with someone wearing trail runners unloaded from a backpack months earlier. From their spacing, he calculated they'd arrived on foot, no vehicle. They'd skirted the known entrances, avoided cameras, entered after dark, and melted into the monitoring grid. The next day, someone removed the infrared motion sensor near the dry creek wash, cutting it clean in half with wire cutters, then left the severed cable tied in a knot on the post. That cable had belonged to Marissa's private security contractor, which meant the repair cost would be logged and billed, but more importantly, it meant increased vulnerability. Ryder felt his pulse slow. Procedural calm, technical assessment. But inside, the knot of nerves tightened. He understood that this was not protest. It was sabotage. It was message. It was turning a court injunction into a defiance test. He moved swiftly. After documenting the severed sensor and photographing the tracks, he also collected soil samples around the fence to determine footprint type and booked a forensic inspection through a local agritech lab. It tracked rubber tread. Compounds could match them later to models. Then he added the incident to the now-growing legal dossier with time-stamped notes and chain-of-custody logs, kind of evidence system most landowners simply never experience. Meanwhile, the county's legal office faxed him a copy of another complaint, this one styled as a community access motion, filed under the public right-of-way statutes. The document was professional, typeset, signed with a pen. It claimed that long-standing, informal easements allowed recreational walkers through multiple parcels in the area, including part of Ryder's acre, and that his fencing constituted a barrier to historical community use. The complaint cited 3 separate local statutes but provided no historical documentation or witness declarations beyond items scribbled by Karen in her initial sketch map. Yet, because it looked official, the county was obliged to evaluate it. Ryder instructed Marissa to file a motion to dismiss for improper form and lack of substantiation, along with a request for sanctions. He ordered reproduction of boundary surveys, affidavits from the original family that sold the land to his great-uncle in 1952, and signed statements from neighbors who'd never used the area. Meanwhile, Wayne Talbot worked quietly behind the scenes to track county clerks' behavior around the filing. Any irregularity, footnote, or slow lane could be used to prove that the motion was being fast-tracked under questionable influence. Because if the complaint was Karen's ploy, the proper remedy wasn't to fight it head-on. It was to prove procedural unfairness and misuse of administrative channels. Yet that same week brought a more personal and unsettling incident. Ryder's main house mailbox, a sturdy steel unit mounted at the ranch entrance, was found shattered, lying in the dirt with the door hanging off the hinge. His official mail, legal forwarding information, bank account notifications, some missing. He called the postal inspector, who filed a report, but could only say that tampering of rural mailboxes was a federal misdemeanor. Meanwhile, Ryder replaced the mailbox with a reinforced model and added a camera to monitor delivery attempts. He also moved sensitive correspondence to digital encrypted files, but made paper backup for physical record-keeping. It was bureaucratic overkill, but again he did it because someone was testing his processes, his perimeter, his legal footing, his intelligence flow. Procedures that had worked fine when the threat was passive now needed to hold up under deliberate intent. Another escalation came in form of a guerrilla hiking event, organized via social media under Karen's affiliate branding. A flyer posted in local coffee shops and distributed at a women's auxiliary meeting advertised a full moon flora survey walk, but also stated that light refreshments and boxed lunches would be provided at dusk, and participants were encouraged to wander freely through several mapped stops. Ryder noticed the ads because the flyer bore his name and the land address. He understood that even with the restraining order, second-order associations could damage his credibility. He tasked Wayne with identifying the printer and distributors. They traced the flyers to a local print shop, which claimed to have printed them from a web template submitted over the internet anonymously. The print shop cooperated only under subpoena. Ryder authorized it. He now had IP logs and transaction records and added them to the dossier. But the event happened anyway. The evening of the advertised night, about 30 people assembled at the Lower Creek parking area well outside the perimeter and wandered across at least halfway into his property before security cameras detected movement. The guests were weaving through paths marked with blue ribbon flagging tape that led them past survey markers installed by Karen's sketches. They passed the irrigation pumps and came within sight of the partially restored barn. One of them snapped a photo standing beside the barn and posted it live, captioning it, "Incredible find at Dawn Ranch. Thanks, Karen." It went viral for a few hours. Ryder shut it down before dawn. He confronted them quietly and escorted everyone out. He issued trespass notices to 8 individuals who'd crossed beyond the signed boundary. But the damage felt symbolic. Narrative momentum was shifting as others believed the land was in public use, or at least community-friendly property. He logged the event, served notices, and filed reports with the sheriff. He also arranged to have the unruly footage removed or flagged under the restraining order's takedown provisions. Then came another blow, an act that crossed a line into financial sabotage. One morning, Ryder woke to see his desktop computer wiped clean. The next-generation media hub that stored his video, audio, and log files was corrupted. Files gone, thumbnails replaced by folder icons marked trashed. He called it help. They confirmed it was malware. Someone had gained remote access, wiped the system, and attempted to wipe backup cloud archives with poor credentials. It was sloppy, but deliberate. Fortunately, data had been backed up on encrypted physical drives and through encrypted off-site backups. Ryder recovered most of the files, but the incident cost him time, expense, and most of all, reminders that he was operating in a different league now. He called Wayne. Wayne recommended bringing in a cybersecurity consultant with a formal chain of custody logs. Ryder did. He wrote checks, added invoices into his folder system, and tagged the event as potential criminal tampering, actionable if the perpetrator could be identified. Despite the turmoil, Ryder did something most people wouldn't. He maintained routine. He replaced the sensor and recalibrated the pump. He walked the water pass trenches. He checked the well valve and pressed cold water through the lines to ensure functionality. He seeded native grasses in one of the erosion zones, just as if none of this was happening because that's what he inherited, land that needed care. Legal disputes paused in courtrooms while scheduling next pleadings. County Council later submitted a motion to strike Karen's access motion for procedural deficiencies, and that motion was granted, with nominal sanctions against the filer. But Karen appealed. Ryder's side counters that the appeal is frivolous. Still, appellate filings slow the process down and keep him from full closure. Through all of it, threats continued in indirect ways. A neighbor reported that someone rang his doorbell at night and walked away when it went unanswered. Someone else said they saw a gray SUV parked at the end of the driveway for several hours one evening. No one claimed it. No cameras captured faces. It was shadow pressure. And yet, the most effective measure came from Ryder's decision to amplify his message modestly. He allowed a local historical society to perform a controlled walking tour, strictly with owner consent, waiver forms, signed release, limited group size, and later wrote an op-ed in a regional landowners newsletter explaining how landowners could lawfully open private land under controlled conditions versus Karen's unauthorized public tours. Readers wrote in support, landowner attorneys, fellow ranchers, civic leaders. The narrative shift began. The crescendo of the second escalation arrived when Karen herself appeared at his front gate one early morning, hands on her hips, eyes reddened as though by confrontation or frustration. She asked to talk. Ryder, having been advised by Wayne, refused in person and suggested communicating through Marissa. Without permission, though, security camera footage caught her walking alongside the property boundary and leaning over the fence to peer at the irrigation shed. Marissa's cease contact clause invoked. Her return triggered immediate violation notice, recorded, and filed. The legal team prepared for a contempt hearing. The message had been drawn in both words and law. Stay off the property, stay out of the narrative, stop the sabotage, or face escalating consequences. Through this all, Ryder preserved his routine. Early patrols, system checks, boundary reviews, soil sampling, water testing. He restored the ranch's environmental integrity each day, even as he defended its legal integrity around the clock. And as dusk settled one evening, he stood on the ridge where once he'd mapped solar panels and pump lines, looking out at the fences, the signs, the sensor towers, the quiet scrub grass. Below, the irrigation pond reflected fading light. Above, the horizon stretched empty, unclaimed, precisely defined by coordinates and deeds. He felt fatigue. He felt the toll of being tested at every turn. But he also recognized that every intrusion, every flyer, every hacked file built a stronger case. It was escalation, yes, but his response was slow, steady, calculated, and recorded. When the full court hearing came, he would offer not rage, but reasoned proof of a campaign to subvert his rights. And he believed then, as he believed now, that truth had foundations no myth could erode. The second escalation had battered the edges, but the core remained intact. The day of the court hearing arrived with an unexpected chill in the Arizona air, the kind that settled deep in your chest and made every breath feel like a slow warning. Ryder Blaine stood in front of the mirror tying his cufflinks with calm precision, not out of vanity but because discipline mattered more than appearance. He had spent the last 6 months building a case rooted not in outrage but in procedure. Every document, every timestamp, every image arranged into an unassailable narrative of encroachment, manipulation, and deliberate violation of property rights. He wasn't stepping into the courtroom to perform. He was stepping in to finalize what had begun with a laminated flyer nailed to a juniper trunk and escalated into sabotage, false media narratives, and organized community misinformation. Marissa met him on the courthouse steps, briefcase in hand, her expression impassive but firm. They had gone over everything the night before, but Ryder could tell from the tension in her shoulders that she expected today would not be clean. Karen had filed 3 counter motions through her attorney, Dennis, her brother, attempting to reframe the restraining order as an infringement on public discourse and accusing Ryder of attempting to monopolize land historically used by the public, despite a total absence of legal precedent for any kind of communal easement. Inside the courtroom, the judge reviewed both cases in full, a process that consumed the morning in meticulous fashion. Karen sat across the aisle with arms crossed, dressed in soft earth tones, hair carefully arranged to appear disheveled in an endearing way. Her attorney delivered opening statements steeped in appeals to sentiment. Phrases like communal legacy, public trust, and natural belonging filled the air with a deliberate, emotional haze. He showed a photo of a child playing near a stream on Ryder's land, claimed that denying access was a symbolic violence, a refusal to share what nature had provided for everyone. But when Marissa rose, the atmosphere changed. She didn't raise her voice. She read directly from statute, from case law, from constitutional principles regarding private ownership and unlawful interference. She introduced aerial drone images of marked foot traffic paths across Ryder's property, overlaid with digital timestamps and GPS coordinates. She showed screenshots of Karen's advertisements selling access to land she did not own, banking thousands in tour donations. She introduced sworn statements from individuals who had paid Karen directly, and others who admitted they believed the land was publicly owned due to her representations. Ryder watched the judge's eyes during this sequence, not glazing over, not bored, but focused, critical, and, most importantly, unimpressed by emotional deflection. Then came the digital forensics. Wayne had helped coordinate a full cybersecurity audit tracing the malware attack on Ryder's systems to a laptop registered under Dennis Mitchell's name. The access came through a VPN, but careless timestamps matched a period during which Dennis was actively editing the Southwest Living Tour's website. When presented with this information, Dennis deflected, claiming he was framed. But Marissa calmly presented metadata from the website codebase showing edits signed with Dennis's user tag, and then followed it with an invoice from a local printer matching QR flyers Karen had distributed, flyers traced to orders placed using her auxiliary club's debit card. With every document submitted, the courtroom air shifted from vague notions of community injustice to hard evidence of commercial fraud and willful misrepresentation. Karen's expression grew tight. Her posture stiffened. When the judge asked her directly whether she had ever received explicit written permission from Ryder to use his land for group access, her answer, "It was understood," hung in the air like a stone dropped in silence. The courtroom recessed at noon for deliberation. Ryder and Marissa waited in a side chamber, not speaking much. She was reviewing procedural notes. He was looking out the window, not thinking of victory, but of return. Not to normalcy, that was gone, but to legitimacy, to silence without intrusion. When they were called back, the judge's voice was direct and unembellished. The court found in Ryder's favor. The restraining order was made permanent. Karen Mitchell was ordered to cease all commercial activities related to the disputed land, to publicly retract claims of partnership with public or academic institutions, and to pay financial restitution for damage to property and legal fees. The court also opened a separate criminal referral regarding digital intrusion, now involving Dennis. The ruling didn't contain dramatics. It was dry, legal, enforceable. But for Ryder, it was a wall reinforced in concrete, not symbolic, not emotional, but judicial. When they exited the courthouse, Karen avoided his eyes. She spoke briefly to reporters gathered outside, voicing her intention to appeal. Her tone lacked conviction. The crowd was smaller than before. In the days that followed, Ryder returned to the ranch not as a man relieved, but as a man resuming order. He walked the perimeter fence and reinforced the weaker posts, checked his sensors, and restored the damaged shed one final time. He posted the court ruling in a waterproof case at the main entrance, along with updated signage referencing the legal decision. Then he removed the laminated notices Karen had scattered around the periphery months earlier, the ones with poetic quotes about public belonging and sacred access. He burned them in a controlled fire pit, watching the plastic curl and darken, not with vengeance, but with the sterile satisfaction of closure. He also met with a survey team to conduct a final GPS sweep, not because he expected further dispute, but because accuracy was his anchor. A week later, a formal letter arrived, this time not from Karen, but from a member of the Community Land Trust that had supported her. It was apologetic, subdued. The author admitted they had believed the land was publicly available, and that Karen's leadership had seemed credible. They offered to issue a formal retraction of support and to publish a clarification about Ryder's ownership. He wrote back simply, stating he accepted the gesture, but preferred that they instead educate others on the difference between communal romanticism and legal fact. It wasn't about winning. It was about undoing the myth without perpetuating another. But not all damage could be undone. The ecosystem had absorbed the stress. Paths worn down where none should be, erosion near the stream from excessive foot traffic, disrupted nesting patterns documented by Ryder's own fieldwork. He began restoration work slowly, planting new barriers, bringing in seed mixes for recovery zones. He adjusted the soil depth near one of the sensor stations that had been vandalized, packing gravel and sand layers to ensure long-term durability. He worked quietly, not as a man tending to land for show, but for purpose. Because beyond the court rulings and news clips, beyond the cease and desists and the affidavit bundles, there remained the simple fact of ownership, not of territory, but of stewardship. Karen's appeal was filed, but poorly constructed. Marissa was confident it would be dismissed. And while the legal system moved at its own pace, Ryder moved at his. He did not watch Karen's interviews, did not read the comments online. Instead, he watched the deer return to the trail near the northern bluff. He noticed the soil near the water line start to firm. And one evening, after weeks of silence, he found himself standing in the exact spot where Karen's first group had crossed the boundary, now remarked, reposted, and quiet. He listened to the wind thread its way through the mesquite, and for the first time in months he did not feel watched, challenged, or outflanked. The fight had not been won through force or fury. It had been won through structure, resilience, and an unyielding refusal to surrender legitimacy to narrative. And in the end, that was what Karen never understood. This was never about sharing land. It was about respecting the boundary between truth and desire, and Ryder had defended that boundary not with rhetoric, but with every calibrated, deliberate act of quiet resistance. It had been 3 months since the final court ruling, and the land was quiet again. Not in the fragile anticipatory way it had been before the conflict, but in a deeper, earned sense of stillness. The sensors remained operational, recalibrated to higher sensitivity. The boundary lines had been re-cleared, marked not only with signage but with a low, functional post and cable system that left no doubt about where one world ended and another began. Ryder kept the legal documents sealed in a weatherproof lockbox inside the main shed, not because he expected further challenge, but because experience had taught him that certainty should be documented and preserved like any other critical infrastructure. The erosion paths caused by foot traffic had begun to fade, thanks to seeding and natural regrowth, and the northern bluff, once photographed and geotagged by Karen's guests without his knowledge, was no longer public knowledge, its access obscured. Again by new brush and strategically placed fencing. Karen Mitchell had not appeared publicly since the appeal was dismissed. Her affiliate LLC had been suspended for failure to comply with consumer disclosure regulations, and the small online following she had cultivated over a year of self-mythologizing quietly withered under the weight of legal exposure and reputational loss. Her final video post, recorded weeks before the court's final decision, attempted to reframe her actions as imperfect efforts to foster dialogue, but by then even her defenders had begun to distance themselves. Her name still surfaced occasionally in quiet conversations at local cafes or in grumbling forum threads, but always with a cautionary tone now. She had not only lost her case, she had revealed just how thin her foundation had been all along. Ryder never responded to these murmurs. He had no need to. The land itself had returned to him more fully than any court ever could, not only in law, but in function. With the legal campaign behind him, Ryder rechanneled his focus to what had always mattered most: the work. He resumed his hydrology mapping, adjusted the flow rates at the pump stations, restored the dry wash terraces near the southern fence, and resumed sending data to the regional conservation database. But something in him had changed, not hardened, but sharpened. The past year had redefined ownership for him. No longer did it exist merely as a matter of title or topography. Now, ownership meant vigilance, not paranoia. It meant preservation, not isolation. It meant remembering that the greatest threats did not always come from bulldozers or backhoes, but from people with charming smiles and vague intentions, wielding myths like crowbars. Occasionally, he would receive mail from other landowners, some asking for advice on boundary management, others simply expressing gratitude that someone had pushed back against the growing erosion of legal ownership under the guise of public good. He always responded, not with instruction, but with structure. Templates for notice letters, guides for evidentiary logs, links to reliable surveyors and private security firms who knew how to document without escalation. He wasn't a crusader. He had no interest in becoming one. But he understood now that silence, while comforting, could also be permissive. He learned to speak where it mattered, not online, not on stages, but in declarations, affidavits, field reports. His language became that of measured resistance. Not loud, not aggressive, but unyielding. On the anniversary of the first tour Karen led through his property, the one he'd stumbled upon without warning, Ryder stood near the ridge with a mug of black coffee, the same spot where months of conflict had quietly begun. The path below was overgrown now, reclaimed by wild grasses and the slow patience of desert time. No ribbons fluttered from trees, no footprints marred the soil, no guests ambled with water bottles and picnic blankets. The only sound was wind through juniper and the distant hum of pump stations regulating water flow underground. He watched the horizon for a while, not looking for movement, but anchoring himself in the simplicity of uninterrupted lines. He did not feel victorious. He felt resolved. The line had held, not because